I still remember the silver spoon clinking against porcelain that morning. My brother-in-law smiled, handing me a cappuccino with a courteous smile. 4 hours later, sitting in the emergency room with a spinning head, I heard the doctor ask, "Are you certain you only consumed what you personally watched being poured?" The most terrifying part was not the foreign drug in my veins. It was the pre-written plan waiting to brand me as unstable and steal my life's work. I am Pamela Prescott. At 37 years old, I had spent the majority of my adult life carefully constructing a reputation as the woman who could handle absolutely anything. As the director of contracts at Meridian Vale Risk Group, an infrastructure consulting firm in North Carolina, built on a rigid foundation of ruthless discipline and total transparency. My daily life was a relentless parade of mitigating disasters, restructuring failed agreements, and bringing order to chaotic corporate landscapes. People came to me when things were falling apart because I did not panic. I assessed the damage, I strategized, and I fixed the problem. I was the fixer. And unfortunately for me, that professional title bled seamlessly into my personal life, wrapping around my neck like a heavy, invisible chain. For over 10 years, I had worked like a machine, putting in 80-hour work weeks, sacrificing holidays, and earning every promotion and every ounce of respect the incredibly hard way. That unyielding work ethic was exactly why my grandmother, Evelyn, had made her final, unalterable decision before she passed away last winter. Just 48 hours ago, I had officially been designated as the sole operating trustee of the Prescott Landing Trust. This was not merely a ceremonial title or a symbolic gesture of love. The trust held the controlling interest in a sprawling, extraordinarily valuable stretch of riverfront property that had been in our family for 4 generations. Holding the reins meant I alone possessed the legal authority to decide the fate of those acres. I could sell the land off in pieces to the highest bidding commercial developers for a massive, immediate profit, or I could hold on to it and guide it towards sustainable, community-focused development. Exactly as Evelyn had envisioned in her final years, she knew I would fight tooth and nail for her vision. She knew I would not crumble under the crushing weight of financial temptation. But family pressure is a unique, suffocating kind of weight. On the surface, the Prescotts were the absolute picture of refined Southern politeness. We hosted elegant charity dinners, sent meticulously handwritten thank you notes on heavy cardstock, and never, under any circumstances, raised our voices in public. Yet, just beneath that glossy veneer of refinement lay a deeply ingrained, highly toxic truth that everyone in our circle accepted but no one dared speak aloud. My parents, Victor and Elaine, possessed an endless, bottomless well of soft-hearted leniency when it came to my younger sister, Delaney. Delaney was treated as the fragile one, the delicate flower who needed constant protecting, the one whose massive mistakes were simply brushed away as youthful growing pains, even as she navigated her 30s. I, on the other hand, was born to be the family shock absorber. From the time I was a young girl, the unspoken, ironclad rule of our household was that Pamela would yield. Pamela would understand the bigger picture. Pamela would gladly sacrifice her own preferences, her own time, and her own joy to keep the domestic peace. If Delaney wanted the larger bedroom, I quietly packed my things into boxes. If Delaney caused a scene at a family gathering because she overspent her allowance, I was the one tasked with smoothing it over with the relatives so my parents would not have to deal with the stress. I was the highly capable daughter, which somehow translated in their minds to the daughter who required absolutely no care, no defense, and deserved no grace. Then came Grant Holloway. When Delaney married Grant 5 years ago, my parents were absolutely thrilled. They acted as if she had won a grand prize. Grant was a masterclass in performative charm. He was a man with a perpetually smooth voice, always armed with the exact right, flattering compliments for the older generation. He rushed to hold doors. He poured expensive wine with a practiced flourish. And he always laughed loudly at my father's tired, repetitive golf jokes. But I never trusted him, not for a single. fleeting second. While my parents saw a devoted, hard-working son-in-law, I saw a man who evaluated every single human interaction based entirely on what it could yield for his own bank account. The way Grant looked at our family's assets was never with the casual appreciation of a welcomed outsider. It was the calculating, hungry gaze of a thief staring at an unlocked vault. He was always asking subtle, probing questions about property taxes, zoning laws, and the exact specifics of Evelyn's declining health. I always kept my distance, treating him with the exact same professional coolness I utilized during the most difficult contract negotiations at Meridian Vale Risk Group. To mark the official, legal transfer of the trust, I decided to host a small, intimate brunch. I chose the Glass House, a stunning architectural structure with floor-to-ceiling windows sitting right on the grassy edge of the riverfront property I was now sworn to protect. The early morning light filtered beautifully through the clean glass panes, casting a warm, golden glow over the long, rustic oak table. I had arranged for a high-end local caterer to bring in platters of fresh fruit tarts, smoked salmon, artisan cheeses, and a wide selection of premium teas and locally roasted coffees. I invited my parents, Delaney, Grant, our longtime family lawyer, Rosalind Vale, and two of my oldest friends who had supported me through the grueling legal battles of the past 6 months. On the surface, it was meant to be a cozy, celebratory gathering, a quiet moment to raise a glass to Evelyn's memory and to honor the staggering amount of hard work I had put in to secure the family's legacy. As I arranged the crisp linen napkins and double-checked the intricate floral centerpieces, I allowed myself to feel a rare, incredibly fragile flicker of hope. I genuinely hoped that, for this one day, my parents would look at me and acknowledge my massive achievement without instantly pivoting the conversation to Delaney's recent emotional struggles. I hoped we could sit together around that oak table not as a collection of competing financial interests, but as a family respecting the heavy responsibility I had just bravely taken on. But as the guests began to arrive and fill the space, the entire atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, like a drop of cold water down the back of the neck. My mother walked in, barely glancing at the beautiful spread I had arranged before rushing over to forcefully adjust Delaney's collar. "Delaney, you look terribly pale," my mother whispered loudly, her brow furrowed in deep concern. "Did you manage to get a full 8 hours of sleep last night?" My father walked past the food station, giving me a brief, stiff, one-armed hug. He did not offer a single word of congratulations. Instead, he leaned in close to my ear. "We need to move fast before the buyers lose interest," he muttered, his tone strictly business. "The commercial real estate market is hitting its absolute peak, Pamela. We need to schedule a serious sit-down conversation about liquidating these riverfront assets before the second quarter ends." Through the clear glass walls, the river flowed quietly, a stark contrast to the rising noise inside the structure. Crystal glasses clinked together, polite, hollow laughter echoed against the glass, and the smell of my mother's expensive floral perfume mixed heavily with the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans. Everyone was smiling brightly. Everyone was playing their assigned part perfectly. Yet, beneath the polite toasts and the polished silver cutlery, an invisible, suffocating current of greed and expectation pulled aggressively at the edges of the room. I could feel their eyes on me. They were not looking at me as the proud, new steward of our grandmother's cherished legacy. They were looking at me as the one and only obstacle standing between them and a massive, life-altering financial payout. Grant was particularly, almost unnervingly animated that morning. He moved effortlessly through the crowded room, his presence filling every corner. "Let me get that heavy pitcher for you, Rosalind," Grant said smoothly, flashing his bright white teeth as he took the water from the lawyer's hands. He wore a crisp, tailored navy shirt, his sleeves rolled up just enough to make him look casually industrious and completely at ease. Every single time our eyes met across the room, he offered a bright, entirely empty smile that did not reach his cold eyes. I brushed off the uneasy, twisting feeling settling deep in my stomach, firmly attributing it to the immense stress and lack of sleep over the past few weeks. I told myself I was simply being paranoid, a standard professional hazard of spending my days aggressively hunting for hidden loopholes in massive corporate contracts. I stood near the head of the table, holding a small glass of sparkling water, taking a slow, deep breath of the damp, river-scented air seeping in through a slightly cracked window. I stepped into that bright, beautiful morning with the deeply naive belief that the people who shared my blood would eventually learn to respect my boundaries and my newfound legal authority. I truly, foolishly believed the bitter battle for the trust was officially over the moment the ink dried on the final legal documents. I had absolutely no idea that they had walked into my beautiful glasshouse not to celebrate my hard-won victory, but to ruthlessly execute a completely different plan. The morning sun climbed higher, heating the interior of the glasshouse until it felt like a beautifully decorated terrarium. Guests broke into small, predictable clusters as I watched the familiar dynamics play out. Grant did something entirely out of character. He abandoned his usual strategy of hovering near the most important person in the room and deliberately positioned himself behind the large, gleaming chrome espresso machine stationed at the far end of the catering spread. "Ladies and gentlemen, step right up," Grant called out, his voice cutting through the soft, ambient chatter. He flashed that practiced, brilliant smile. "Today, I am at your service. But first, I must prepare something special for the queen of the morning." My posture stiffened instinctively. The hairs on my arms rose just a fraction. Grant never volunteered for menial tasks. He possessed a profound allergy to serving others unless the act guaranteed a high return on investment or a captive audience. Watching him expertly steam the milk, his shoulders moving with exaggerated flair, struck a discordant note in my mind. It was a performance, and Grant only performed when he needed applause or a massive distraction. I tore my gaze away from him and looked around the room. In the far corner, by the towering ferns, Delaney was heavily engrossed in a hushed conversation with our mother. Elaine was stroking Delaney's arm, her face pulled into an expression of intense, protective sympathy. Near the front entrance, my father had cornered Rosalind Vale. The lawyer was attempting to review the thick stack of final trust documents resting on a high-top table. But Victor was relentlessly in her ear. "I am telling you, Rosalind, holding on to this dirt is a massive mistake," my father insisted, his voice carrying over the gentle jazz playing from the hidden speakers. "If we move quickly, we can have buyers lined up in 14 days. The commercial developers are practically begging for this kind of acreage. We could liquidate, distribute the assets in 90 days, and save Pamela a lifetime of bureaucratic headaches." Rosalind adjusted her glasses, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the legal clauses. "Victor, the trust dictates that Pamela has sole discretion. My job is merely to ensure the transfer of authority is legally binding by 12 o'clock today." Before my father could launch into another aggressive rebuttal, Grant was suddenly stepping into my line of sight. He navigated through the small crowd, holding a pristine white porcelain cup and saucer. He moved with a theatrical kind of caution, holding the coffee aloft as if it were a fragile artifact. "Here you go," Grant said, presenting the cup to me with a slight, mocking bow. "One perfect cappuccino. I made sure to use exactly half a packet of raw sugar and extra foam, just the way you always order it when we go to the city." I took the warm saucer from his hands, feeling a brief, confusing flash of surprise. It was a remarkably specific detail for him to remember. "Thank you, Grant. That is surprisingly observant of you." "I pay attention to the important things," he replied, winking. "Drink up. You have a big speech to give, and we need our fearless leader heavily caffeinated." He lingered for a second too long, watching my face. I brought the cup to my lips and took a slow sip through the thick layer of froth. Instantly, my taste buds recoiled. Beneath the rich espresso and the sweet milk, there was a harsh, bitter undertone. It tasted sharp, almost like licking a tarnished copper coin. I lowered the cup, my brow furrowing as I looked down at the pale brown liquid. "Is something wrong with the roast?" Grant asked immediately. His voice was perfectly casual, yet his eyes were locked onto mine with an unblinking intensity. It tastes a little metallic, I murmured, taking another tiny, hesitant sip. The bitter chemical tang was definitely there, hiding under the sweet cinnamon. Grant chuckled, a warm, dismissive sound that effortlessly smoothed over the awkward moment. You are just wound tight today, Pamela. Cortisol does crazy things to your palate. Plus, these fancy catering machines always spit out a little mineral buildup on the first few runs. Drink it down. It's probably just the machine. He smoothly clapped me on the shoulder and turned away to rejoin my father. I stood there, holding the cup, rationalizing the taste just as he had suggested. I was indeed exhausted. I had slept barely 4 hours the night before, poring over the final addendums of the trust. I took a larger swallow, ignoring the bitterness. Desperate for the caffeine to kickstart my tired brain, I finished half the cup before setting it aside on a nearby windowsill. Exactly 20 minutes later, I stood at the head of the long oak table. Rosalind had laid out the final signature pages on a leather portfolio. The room fell silent as I picked up my glass of water to clink it with a silver spoon. I smiled at the expectant faces turned toward me. I want to thank all of you for being here this morning, I began, my voice clear and steady. Evelyn loved this land. She believed this property was not just an asset, but a massive responsibility. And I am deeply honored to— I stopped. A sudden, violent thud echoed in my chest, completely out of rhythm. My heart seemed to skip a single beat, then launched into a rapid, fluttering panic. I took a deep breath, trying to push past the sudden wave of intense heat rushing up my neck. I am deeply honored to take on this stewardship, I continued. But the words felt thick and heavy on my tongue. The syllables were dragging, turning muddy and unrecognizable. I looked down at the legal documents resting on the portfolio, but the stark black text was beginning to swim. The letters detached from the crisp white paper, floating and vibrating. A terrifying, icy numbness started at the tips of my fingers and rapidly shot up my arms. The edges of the beautiful glasshouse began to blur, the bright morning light suddenly harsh and blinding. Are you all right, dear? Rosalind asked softly, stepping closer. I tried to nod, but my head felt entirely disconnected from my neck. The floor beneath my low heels pitched violently, like the deck of a ship caught in a sudden storm. I opened my mouth to say I just needed to sit down, but only a soft, unintelligible exhale escaped my lips. My right hand, holding the thick manila folder containing the trust addendums, simply gave up. The muscles went completely slack. The folder slipped from my grip. Dozens of white pages cascaded through the air, fluttering to the hardwood floor in a chaotic mess. I swayed heavily to the left, my knees buckling under a sudden, terrifying weightlessness. Before my shoulder could even graze the edge of the table, a pair of strong hands clamped down hard on my arms, hauling me upright. "I have got her!" Grant shouted. His voice was incredibly loud, booming off the glass walls, commanding the entire room's attention. "Someone clear a chair. She is collapsing." My vision was a smear of colors, but I could hear the sudden chaos erupting around me. Chairs scraping, my mother gasping, my father demanding to know what was happening. Through the thick, heavy fog descending over my brain, a cold spike of clarity pierced through my panic. Grant was right there. He had crossed the room with impossible speed. It was as if he had been standing perfectly still, fully coiled, waiting for the exact second my knees gave way. He guided me roughly into a heavy wooden chair, pressing my head down toward my knees. "Give her space," he ordered the crowd. Then, he looked directly at my parents, his tone dripping with practiced, sorrowful certainty. I knew this would happen. I told Delaney just last night. Pamela has been pushing herself way too hard at the firm. She's burning out. She's pushed herself too hard again. I sat there, paralyzed, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, unable to form a single word of protest. The drug was pulling me under fast, dragging me into a dark, suffocating confusion. But even as the world went dark, The horrifying realization echoed in my failing mind. Grant was not reacting to a sudden emergency. He was executing a carefully rehearsed script. He was the first to reach me, the first to diagnose me, and the very first to tell my family exactly what narrative they needed to believe. He was not saving me from a terrible fall. He was ensuring the trap snapped completely shut. The ride to the hospital was a terrifying blur of passing streetlights and the sound of Nora Beckett swearing quietly behind the steering wheel. We had abandoned the beautiful glass house, leaving my confused guests behind, because my condition was rapidly deteriorating. Nearly an hour had passed since my legs completely gave out beneath me, yet the violent, uncontrollable tremors in my hands refused to subside. My chest felt as though it were wrapped tightly in thick iron bands, making every single breath a shallow, agonizing effort. Nora bypassed the crowded waiting room entirely, her sharp, authoritative voice cutting right through the triage nurse's administrative apathy. Within minutes, I was sitting upright on the crinkling paper of a sterile examination bed. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead pulsed imperfect, agonizing time with the sickening throb behind my eyes. I gripped the thin, cold metal rails of the hospital bed with all my remaining strength, desperately trying to anchor my floating, spinning consciousness to something solid in the room. The attending physician was a tall, no-nonsense woman with deeply lined, tired eyes who clearly did not have the patience to mince words. She flashed a blinding penlight into my dilated pupils, checked my erratic pulse against my wrist, and frowned deeply at the steady beep of the vital monitor. Ms. Prescott, this does not present as a standard vasovagal syncope or basic physical fatigue, she stated, her voice clinically detached and entirely devoid of bedside manner. Your heart rate is wildly inconsistent, and your basic motor functions are severely delayed. Honestly, your autonomic nervous system is currently acting as though it is fighting a massive chemical war. This presentation closely mimics an acute, adverse reaction to a central nervous system depressant, most likely a heavy sedative, interacting very badly with a mild stimulant or perhaps a serving of alcohol. The terrifying words hung heavily in the freezing, sterile air of the emergency room. A heavy sedative. I stared blankly at the plain white wall opposite my bed, my thick, sluggish brain struggling violently to process the horrific equation she had just presented. A depressant mixed with a stimulant or alcohol. I forced my mind to rigidly catalog the entire morning. I had consumed exactly half a crystal flute of celebratory champagne during the opening toast with the lawyers. And before that, the only other thing that had crossed my lips was the custom-made cappuccino Grant had so generously, so proudly delivered directly into my hands. The sharp, strange metallic bitterness I had foolishly brushed off as harmless machine residue suddenly clawed its way to the forefront of my memory. I had not collapsed from the overwhelming weight of my new responsibilities. I had been intentionally poisoned. Before I could force my uncooperative tongue to voice this horrifying realization to Nora, the thin privacy curtain was violently yanked back. My parents stepped into the cramped medical space. They had managed to beat Delaney to the hospital, but their faces bore absolutely zero trace of genuine parental panic. Victor casually adjusted his expensive silk tie, his jaw set in a hard, deeply disapproving line, while Elaine immediately began smoothing out the non-existent wrinkles in her tailored designer skirt. Well, this is certainly a highly dramatic turn of events. My mother sighed heavily, deliberately keeping her voice low so the passing nurses in the hallway would not hear her complaints. She did not reach out to hold my trembling hand or touch my forehead. Instead, she looked at the clear IV line slowly dripping cold saline into my left arm with outright, undisguised distaste. Pamela, darling, do we really need to be hiding in an emergency room? People in our circle talk. We left the primary investors sitting alone in an empty glass house. You are simply overstressed from your corporate job. Please, I am begging you, let us not turn a happy family occasion into a completely unnecessary public scandal. Your mother is absolutely right, Victor added smoothly, checking his heavy gold wristwatch for the second time since entering the room. You have have always had a terrible habit of taking on significantly more than you can physically manage. We need to check you out of this facility immediately. We can handle the complicated trust logistics later this week. But suffering a highly visible medical episode on the exact day you assume control of the estate, it makes you look incredibly unstable to the board. They were not standing there to comfort their sick daughter. They were standing there purely for rapid damage control. My own body was actively betraying me. My lungs were fighting desperately for oxygen, and my parents were only concerned about the negative optics of an ambulance ruining their accelerated real estate timeline. Then, Grant slipped quietly through the curtain. His sudden presence instantly sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the small room. He looked far too calm, every hair in place, his face arranged into a careful mask of concern. He patted Victor reassuringly on the shoulder and offered Elaine a deeply comforting nod before stepping right up to the very edge of my bed. "How is our girl holding up?" Grant asked softly, looking down at me with those cold, infinitely calculating eyes. He knew exactly how I was doing. He had carefully engineered this exact scenario. I got Delaney settled safely back at the main house. She was terribly shaken up seeing you collapse in front of everyone like that. "You really gave us a massive scare today, Pam." I tried to speak, to scream at him to get away from me, but my vocal cords refused to obey. Nora stepped aggressively closer to the bed, physically blocking his path, her eyes narrowing dangerously at him. "The doctors are running comprehensive blood panels right now," Nora said coldly, her tone a clear warning. Grant did not even flinch. His sympathetic smile remained perfectly fixed, terrifyingly confident. "Of course they are. Better safe than sorry. But listen, Pamela, I know how much you constantly worry about your standing at Meridian Vale Risk Group. You have that massive, high-stakes infrastructure deal pending next week. You need absolute rest. Let me call your firm for you right now. I will personally speak to your senior partners. I will just explain that you suffered a severe exhaustion episode due to extreme work pressure and simply need a few days completely off the grid to recover your mental health." A violent, involuntary shiver ran straight down my spine, as cold and sharp as a surgical scalpel. I had never, not once in my rigorous 10-year career, asked a family member to communicate with my workplace. My professional life was a fiercely guarded fortress. Grant actively volunteering to breach that fortress was not a random act of familial kindness. It was a highly calculated strike. If a rumor of me losing complete control, of suffering a sudden mental break, reached the senior partners at my firm right as I took over a multi-million-dollar family trust, the professional damage would be catastrophic. It would neatly validate whatever toxic narrative he was currently spinning to my parents about my fundamental instability. I forced Nora to drive me straight home that evening, flatly refusing the doctor's strong recommendation to stay overnight under the hospital's depressing fluorescent glare. I locked myself securely inside my quiet bedroom, staring blankly at the dark ceiling as the heavy, suffocating fog in my head slowly, painfully began to lift. By the time the bright sun peeked through the wooden blinds the next morning, my hands had finally stopped their pathetic shaking, entirely replaced by a cold, hollow, absolute rage. At exactly 8 o'clock sharp, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly against the nightstand. It was an unidentified private number. The caller quickly identified himself as a senior resident doctor from the emergency room toxicology department. "Ms. Prescott, I wanted to follow up with you directly and privately," the young doctor said, his voice dropping to a serious, highly confidential whisper. "We authorized a rush on the comprehensive toxicology screen because of your highly unusual physical presentation. The final results came back from the lab late last night. Your blood showed highly significant traces of a powerful, extremely fast-acting benzodiazepine. It is a severe clinical anxiolytic and heavy sedative, entirely unprescribed anywhere in your medical history. The dosage present in your system was substantial enough to cause profound physical disorientation, sudden muscle weakness, and severe cognitive impairment lasting for several hours. Frankly, had you consumed a second glass of alcohol, your respiratory system might have shut down completely. The clinical confirmation hit me like a solid physical blow to the stomach, the strange metallic taste, the sudden, terrifying drop in blood pressure, the inability to form a simple sentence. It was no longer a wild, paranoid theory born from panic. It was a clinically proven, scientifically documented fact. Before I could even begin to process the doctor's chilling words, a bright red, urgent notification popped up on my open laptop screen. It was an encrypted message from my direct managing supervisor at Meridian Vale Risk Group, heavily marked as highly confidential. My fingers felt stiff and icy as I quickly typed in the password to open the secure company portal. The message was devastatingly brief, but its professional implications were entirely nuclear. The Corporate Human Resources Department had received a highly detailed, anonymous, encrypted email late last night. The unknown sender claimed to be a deeply concerned associate, explicitly stating that Pamela Prescott was currently battling a severe, completely undisclosed substance abuse problem. The email meticulously detailed a public, humiliating physical collapse that had occurred earlier that very day, firmly concluding that I was completely mentally unfit, highly unstable, and not nearly sober enough to handle sensitive, high-value corporate contracts. I sat completely alone in the deafening quiet of my room, the bright, cheerful morning light washing over my pale face. The invisible trap had not just snapped shut around my ankle. The heavy steel locks were currently being aggressively secured from the outside by someone I was supposed to call family. The foreign drug floating in the porcelain cup was only the physical weapon. The real, terrifying attack was a masterfully orchestrated, simultaneous assassination of my personal character, my entire professional career, and my fundamental right to control my own life. The glass house was entirely silent when I finally returned to the property late that afternoon. The caterers had long since packed away the silver platters and crystal flutes, leaving behind nothing but the long, bare oak table and the lingering scent of stale coffee. The vibrant, celebratory energy of the morning had been completely scrubbed clean, replaced by a hollow, ringing emptiness. I stood in the center of the room, my body still aching with a dull, chemical exhaustion, but my mind was operating with a terrifying, icy clarity. I needed to anchor my fractured memories to something tangible. Human recollection is deeply flawed, easily manipulated by panic and the persuasive suggestions of others. But machinery possesses no emotions, no allegiances, and absolutely no capacity for deception. Just 3 weeks prior to the brunch, I had authorized the installation of a comprehensive state-of-the-art security system across the entire estate. It was a standard precaution for a property of this immense value, especially with the trust transfer rapidly approaching. High-definition cameras were discreetly mounted in the main kitchen, the long connecting hallway, and the small private office adjacent to the glass house. I walked over to my leather tote bag, pulled out my laptop, and sat down at the head of the empty table. My fingers were still trembling slightly as I typed in my master administrative password, but my resolve was absolute. I pulled up the central dashboard and clicked on the kitchen feed. I dragged the digital scrubber back to exactly 10:30 in the morning, right around the time the guests had started breaking off into their small, predictable clusters. I watched the silent, high-resolution footage play out. Every week, desperate hypothesis I had foolishly entertained about accidental contamination or a simple mix-up instantly crumbled into dust. On the screen, Grant was standing completely alone behind the espresso machine. I watched his body language closely. It was a masterclass in calculated deception. He did not look frantic. He looked methodical. He casually glanced over his left shoulder, ensuring the kitchen door was completely shut and that my parents were thoroughly distracted by their conversation on the outdoor patio. Satisfied that he was entirely unobserved, Grant reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored navy jacket. He extracted a small, dark amber glass vial. It was tiny, easily concealed in the palm of his hand. He placed a pristine white porcelain cup on the counter, separate from the others, with a steady, practiced motion. He unsealed the vial and tipped it over the cup. I could not see the liquid itself, but the deliberate, Careful shake of his wrist indicated he was emptying the entire contents. He then pulled a shot of espresso directly over the foreign substance, added the steamed milk, and picked up a silver spoon to stir the mixture aggressively, ensuring the heavy sedative was completely dissolved into the sweet liquid. What he did next was perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire sequence. Grant tore off a small piece of paper towel from the dispenser. He carefully wiped down the very rim of the porcelain cup. He was making absolutely certain that no bitter residue lingered on the edge to warn my lips before I took a full, deep swallow. But his disturbing performance did not end there. Grant stepped back, pulled his smartphone from his trousers, and meticulously arranged the scene. He placed the poisoned cappuccino directly next to a thick, leather-bound folder clearly embossed with the Trust logo. He framed the shot and took a photograph. He was intentionally manufacturing digital evidence. He was creating a visual record to subtly imply that I was casually self-medicating, drinking heavily altered beverages, while simultaneously handling extremely sensitive legal documents. I paused the video, staring at his frozen, handsome face on my screen. The sheer sociopathy of the act took my breath away. He was not just trying to incapacitate me, he was building an airtight, heavily documented case against my sanity. I closed the kitchen feed and immediately opened the hallway camera. I needed to track his exact movements from the moment he left the coffee station to the moment he handed me the cup. The timestamp read 10:35. Grant pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, holding the cup and saucer. But he did not turn right to enter the main glass house where I was standing. Instead, he turned sharply to the left. He walked directly toward the heavy mahogany door of the small private office. This was the exact room where Rosalind Vale had temporarily stored her leather briefcase and the overflow of unsigned trust documents before the formal presentation. I watched as Grant balanced the saucer on his forearm, reached out with his free hand, and quickly punched a sequence into the digital keypad on the door. The heavy lock flashed green, and he slipped inside, pulling the door completely shut behind him. 2 full minutes passed on the timestamp, 120 seconds of him entirely alone in a room filled with my most sensitive legal files. When he finally emerged back into the hallway, his face had undergone a complete transformation. The cold, calculating stare was entirely gone, seamlessly replaced by the bright, charming, utterly fake smile he wore when he finally approached me in the glass house to deliver his poison. A new wave of cold dread washed over me. I picked up my phone and opened the administrative application for the smart lock system. I scrolled rapidly through the digital access logs for the private office door. There it was, stamped in black and white. Access granted at 10:35 via a temporary numeric code. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking loudly in the empty room. I had never, under any circumstances, provided Grant Holloway with any security credentials for this property. I had generated a total of 4 temporary codes over the past 2 weeks for the estate manager, the cleaning crew, the florists, and my sister, Delaney, so she could drop off some table linens the day before. I stared at Delaney's name on the digital access log. A heavy, sickening knot formed deep in my stomach. I dialed her number without allowing myself a single second to hesitate. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. "Pamela," Delaney answered. Her voice was thin and strained, tight with panic. "Are you feeling better? Mom and Dad are still completely frantic about your collapse." "I am resting," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any sisterly warmth. "I am actually sitting in the glass house right now. I decided to review the security camera footage from this morning. I wanted to see exactly what happened right before my vision went dark." I stopped talking. I offered absolutely no further information. In the high-stakes world of corporate negotiations, silence is the ultimate weapon. You let the silence stretch until the other person panics and attempts to fill the void. The silence on the line stretched for 5 excruciating seconds. I could hear the faint, rapid sound of Delaney breathing on the other end. An innocent person, a truly concerned sister, would immediately ask a barrage of questions. She would ask if the cameras showed me tripping over a rug, if I looked pale before the fall, or if the footage captured the exact moment of my medical emergency. Delaney asked none of those things. Instead, her voice dropped to a frantic, terrified whisper. "Pamela, listen to me. Please. You're just exhausted. You need to let this go. Please do not do anything to make this go too far. Just leave it alone." She did not ask what I saw, because she already knew there was something terrible to be seen. I ended the call without saying another word. I slowly lowered the phone to the table, the metallic clatter echoing sharply in the large. Empty room. The final. Soft illusions of familial loyalty evaporated into the cold air. This was not a tragic misunderstanding. This was not a petty, jealous sibling rivalry that had accidentally gotten out of hand. From that exact moment, the harsh, undeniable truth crystallized in my mind. Someone had spent weeks calculating this precise attack. They had studied my habits, procured a restricted chemical substance, bypassed my security, and intentionally targeted my cognitive judgment on the exact day I was legally required to assume total financial power. They believed they could strip me of my reputation, my authority, and my life's work simply by painting me as a hysterical, broken woman. They had meticulously planned for a victim. They had no idea they had just given me a reason to fight back. I called Roslyn Vale at exactly 6 o'clock the following morning, well before the sun had fully crested over the North Carolina tree line. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. "Roslyn," I instructed, my voice flat and entirely stripped of any emotional waver, "I need you to institute a hard, immediate freeze on all administrative transfers, wire authorizations, and signature processing regarding the Prescott Landing Trust. I am placing a complete hold on the entire portfolio for the next 72 hours. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Pamela, that is a highly irregular maneuver," Roslyn replied, her professional tone laced with genuine alarm. "The formal transfer of authority was initiated yesterday at the brunch. The pending buyers for the commercial tracts are incredibly anxious to move forward. If we halt the administrative process without a stated legal cause, we risk panicking the investors. Your father has already called my office twice this morning to ask when the final deeds will be registered. Tell my father, and anyone else who asks, that I am conducting a final, independent internal audit of the boundary lines." I lied smoothly. "Do not process a single document. Do not allow anyone access to the trust accounts. If Grant Holloway or my father calls you again, you forward them directly to my voicemail. Am I completely understood?" Reluctantly, Roslyn agreed. With the front door temporarily bolted tight, I needed a crowbar to pry up the floorboards of my family's hidden lives. I reached out to Gideon Pike. Gideon was a brilliantly ruthless forensic accountant I frequently contracted at Meridian Vale Risk Group to untangle hostile corporate takeovers and expose hidden liabilities in massive infrastructure mergers. He operated entirely in the digital shadows, devoid of moral judgment, and he possessed a terrifying ability to track a single missing dollar across a dozen fake shell companies. We communicated via a highly encrypted, private server. I sent him a secure dossier containing the social security numbers, birth dates, and known corporate entities associated with my immediate family members. I need a complete, microscopic financial teardown of my brother-in-law, Grant Holloway, and my sister, Delaney. I typed into the secure chat interface. Pull their credit histories, their mortgage records, and search for any pending civil judgments. Furthermore, I need you to dig deeply into my father, Victor Prescott. Find the bleeding. It took Gideon less than 48 hours to perform the digital autopsy. When he finally requested a secure voice call, his usually deadpan, robotic voice carried a distinct trace of professional disbelief. "Your brother-in-law is a walking, breathing financial catastrophe," Gideon reported, the rapid clacking of his mechanical keyboard echoing through the speaker. Over the past 2 years, Grant and Delaney aggressively speculated on 3 separate luxury rental properties. They completely bypassed traditional financing and used heavily leveraged. Short-term balloon mortgages from secondary, high-interest lenders. They were betting their entire lives on the local real estate market continuing its unnatural upward trajectory. And the market cooled, I deduced, staring out the window at my quiet, manicured lawn. It did not just cool, it completely froze. Gideon corrected sharply. Those 3 properties are currently sitting entirely vacant. The adjustable interest rates spiked 3 months ago, and Grant is now underwater by a staggering margin. The secondary lenders are predatory. Pamela. They are currently circling for an aggressive foreclosure. But that is not even the most interesting part of this disastrous puzzle. Tell me the rest, I demanded. Grant possesses a mediocre corporate salary. He could never have secured those massive commercial loans on his own. Gideon explained. He had a silent, heavily shielded guarantor. Your father. Victor Prescott personally co-signed the largest of the 3 promissory notes, legally utilizing his pristine family credit rating and the implied historical wealth of the Prescott name as a protective shield to get Grant the cash. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the absolute pit of my stomach, radiating a sickening chill outward to my fingertips. My father, the distinguished patriarch who had spent the entire morning of the brunch loudly, aggressively lecturing Roslyn about the urgent need to liquidate the riverfront land. He had never told my mother about this. Elaine would have sooner forfeited her exclusive memberships than jeopardized her pampered, affluent golden years to covertly bankroll another of Grant's foolish, wildly speculative business ventures. Victor was completely, inescapably trapped by his own hubris and his chronic inability to tell Delaney no. How much time do they have before the floor completely collapses under them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Based on the internal default notices I just intercepted from the lending institution's servers, they have exactly 30 days before the creditors initiate aggressive civil litigation. Gideon answered. If Grant cannot produce a massive, multi-million-dollar influx of liquid cash within that precise 30-day window, the lenders will pierce the corporate veil. They will come directly after Delaney's anticipated future distributions from your family trust, and they will absolutely decimate your father's personal estate to recover the remaining balance. The jagged pieces of the puzzle were snapping into a horrifying alignment. This was exactly why Victor was relentlessly, frantically pressuring me to sell the cherished riverfront acreage to a cut-rate commercial development group. A quick, dirty sale would instantly flood the trust with millions in liquid cash. That would allow Victor to secretly siphon off enough capital, disguised as administrative family distributions, to quietly erase Grant's disastrous debts, save his own financial reputation, and keep Elaine entirely in the dark. My grandmother Evelyn's profound dying wish to preserve the land for community sustainability meant absolutely nothing to a man staring directly down the barrel of total bankruptcy. But Gideon was not finished delivering the nightmare. I also ran a sweeping, deep web search through the county's digital legal portal for any unfiled draft documents associated with your family's primary legal counsel. Gideon continued. I found a heavily redacted draft of a legal petition. It has not been formally submitted to a judge yet, but it is fully prepared, formatted, and sitting quietly in a hidden digital queue. What kind of petition? My lungs suddenly felt tight. An emergency injunction to immediately suspend a primary operating trustee. Gideon read aloud. Specifically, it cites obscure legal provisions for temporary removal if the trustee is deemed, and I quote the text directly, incapacitated due to severe health issues, debilitating substance abuse, or demonstrably unstable behavioral patterns. The petition formally requests the immediate appointment of an interim co-trustee board to manage the immediate liquidation of all physical assets. I closed my eyes. The blinding light of the glass house, the sharp metallic taste of the espresso, the carefully orchestrated public collapse. Grant instantly shouting that I was having a mental breakdown. The anonymous, highly destructive email sent directly to the Human Resources Department at Meridian Vale Risk Group. When was this document drafted? Gideon, I asked, though I already knew the answer in my bones. The file metadata clearly shows the final, Polished edits were saved exactly 1 week ago, Gideon replied. 1 week before the brunch. 7 entire days before Grant smiled warmly and handed me that poisoned cup. I abruptly ended the call and sat in the profound, suffocating silence of my home. I forced my analytical mind to review the entire sequence of events, ruthlessly stripping away any lingering, pathetic delusions of familial love or loyalty. The sedative in the cup was never the endgame. It was only the trigger. The real target was the Prescott Landing Trust. If I had simply fainted, the family would have played their parts perfectly. They would have expressed deep, theatrical concern, paraded me before a series of sympathetic, highly paid doctors, and then quietly, regretfully presented that prewritten legal petition to a judge. They would have tearfully sworn under oath that the immense pressure of my corporate career and the new trust responsibilities had driven me to secretly abuse heavy narcotics. They would have held my trembling hand, wiped my tears, and legally stripped me of every single ounce of authority I possessed. Once I was officially declared medically unfit, Victor would instantly assume emergency control. The beloved riverfront land would be sold to the fastest bidder. Grant's massive debts would magically vanish. Delaney would keep her luxurious, insulated lifestyle, and I would be permanently sidelined, heavily medicated, completely disgraced in my industry, and gently patted on the head for being the fragile daughter who simply could not handle the pressure of the real world. This was not just a family coup, it was a calculated theft dressed up as procedure. They had used my own grandmother's legacy as the ultimate prize, my father's desperate, hidden greed as the fuel, and my own trusting nature as the primary weapon against me. They had written the script, forged the evidence, and cast me in the humiliating role of the broken, unstable woman. A terrifying, absolute calm washed over me, chilling my blood to ice. I did not feel the weak, desperate urge to cry. I did not feel the desire to call my parents and scream at them for their profound, unimaginable betrayal. Anger is a loud, messy, deeply inefficient emotion. I was a contract director. I dealt in leverage, calculated risk, and the total, uncompromising destruction of the opposition. Grant and Victor believed they were playing a simple, brutish game of survival, utilizing an over-leveraged real estate bubble and a stolen prescription pad. They had absolutely no idea they had just forced me to flip the entire chessboard. The poisoned cup had been the opening move in a scheme built on signatures, false medical narratives, and my family's complicity. But they had made one fatal, unforgivable miscalculation in their brilliant scheme. They left me awake. They left my mind perfectly, dangerously intact. And they left me holding the one thing they desperately needed to survive the month: the absolute, unyielding power of the pen. I stared at the frozen frame of Grant, holding the small amber vial. The sheer, intoxicating impulse to dial emergency services and physically hand over my laptop to a detective was nearly overwhelming, but I am a professional strategist. I spend my days building airtight corporate contracts because I understand exactly how easily a weak legal clause can be mercilessly exploited in a boardroom. If I marched into a local police precinct with nothing but a silent security video of a man pouring an unidentifiable liquid into a coffee cup, Grant would have his bulletproof defense fully prepared before I even finished giving my initial statement. He would smoothly, confidently claim to the investigating officers that the liquid was a holistic herbal supplement, a specialized powder for my supposed chronic migraines, or merely a harmless liquid vitamin booster he thought I needed. My parents, absolutely terrified of a catastrophic social scandal and desperately trying to hide Victor's impending financial ruin, would immediately close ranks around him. They would happily finance the best defense attorneys in the state to completely gaslight me. They would paint me as the deeply paranoid, overworked, and highly unstable spinster sister who was tragically imagining wild conspiracies due to corporate burnout. I knew I needed significantly more than a smoking gun. I needed to patiently let them pull the trigger so the entire world could clearly see the bullet. I picked up my smartphone and called my mother. When she answered the line, I intentionally let my voice waver, softening the sharp, commanding edges of my usual speaking cadence until I sounded exactly like the broken, deeply exhausted woman they desperately needed me to be. "Mother," I breathed out, allowing a heavy, trembling sigh to carry the single word. "I am still feeling incredibly weak and entirely out of sorts. The doctors think it might be a severe compound stress response. I'm going to take a few days completely off from the firm and just stay quietly at home to rest and think things through. Honestly, I am starting to truly wonder if taking on the enormous pressure of the estate was a massive mistake on my part." The sheer relief radiating from my mother's end of the telephone line was palpable, thick and suffocating like humid summer air. She immediately cooed soft, soothing words, telling me to rest my body, aggressively assuring me that the family would always be there to catch me when I stumbled. They were entirely convinced their vile poison had worked perfectly, successfully shattering my professional confidence and permanently softening my resolve to fight them. While I flawlessly played the fragile, defeated invalid for my blood relatives, I initiated a secondary, highly covert offensive. I reached out to an elite, private digital security firm I had utilized during a particularly nasty corporate espionage case 3 years ago. I handed over my personal smartphone, my Meridian Veil Risk Group encrypted laptop, and granted their technicians full remote access to the brand new network router I had recently installed at the Glass House. It took their lead analyst barely 24 hours to uncover the invisible digital fingerprints left behind at the scene. There had been 7 separate, highly aggressive, but ultimately failed attempts to breach my secure corporate email portal. The specific Internet Protocol address for those targeted, unauthorized logins, originated directly from the newly established wireless network inside the Glass House. Furthermore, the login attempts were specifically time-stamped during the exact hour I was lying helpless and semi-conscious in the emergency room. Grant had not just orchestrated my physical collapse, he had actively, criminally attempted to hack into my professional life. He was undoubtedly hunting for sensitive corporate information to perfectly bolster the anonymous, destructive tip he eventually sent to my human resources department. I met with Roslyn and Nora in the dim, quiet corner of an exclusive private dining club on the far side of the city. Roslyn listened intently to the digital security report, her sharp eyes gleaming with a fierce, predatory approval. "You need to keep looking vulnerable, Pamela," the seasoned lawyer advised, stirring her black tea with a remarkably steady hand. "Arrogant men who believe they have successfully executed a flawless crime are always the most dangerous. But they are also incredibly, predictably sloppy during the waiting period. They want the financial prize desperately. You need to let them confidently stretch their greedy hands out to grab it." Nora eagerly agreed to serve as my undetected eyes and ears inside the enemy camp. Over the next 48 hours, she masterfully played the role of my deeply concerned, hovering best friend. She dropped by my parents' massive estate under the innocent guise of delivering homemade food and checking on the family's fragile emotional state. In reality, Nora was silently, meticulously cataloging every hushed, frantic phone call Victor took behind the closed mahogany doors of his study. She noted exactly how many times Grant paced the hardwood floors, aggressively pushing the false narrative that the commercial land developers were losing patience and threatening to walk away from the lucrative deal entirely. The first major, catastrophic fracture in their unified family front occurred late on a rainy Tuesday night. I was sitting alone in my dark living room, quietly reviewing the forensic accounting files, when a soft, frantic knocking rattled my heavy front door. I checked the exterior porch camera and saw my younger sister standing under the dim yellow light. Delaney was completely drenched in rainwater, her thin shoulders shaking violently against the cold wind. I unlocked the deadbolt and let her step into the dark foyer. She did not bother with standard greetings or polite apologies. She simply collapsed onto the small wooden bench against the wall, buried her face in her wet hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. "I did not know about the cup, Pamela," Delaney choked out, her voice ragged, raw, and thick with terror. "I swear on my own life, I had absolutely no idea he was actually going to drug you." I stood perfectly still in the shadows, letting the cold, Heavy silence completely filled the space between us. I did not offer her a warm towel. I did not reach out to gently stroke her damp hair. I offered her absolutely zero comfort. "But you knew about the massive financial debt," I stated flatly, my voice completely devoid of any sisterly affection. Delaney nodded slowly, her wet blonde hair clinging pitifully to her pale cheeks. "Grant has been completely out of his mind with panic for the last 2 weeks. The secondary lenders have been relentlessly calling my personal phone, threatening to take everything we own. He told me he had a brilliant legal plan to temporarily sideline you, just long enough for Dad to push the commercial land sale through. He promised me it would just be a standard legal maneuver. He said you were far too stubborn for your own good, and we simply needed to force your hand for the ultimate financial survival of our family." My younger sister looked up at me, her red, swollen eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic plea for immediate absolution. She desperately wanted me to magically wash away her guilt, to softly tell me she was merely a helpless victim of her husband's toxic manipulation. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, clinical, deeply hollow detachment. I did not forgive her betrayal, but I also recognized her immense strategic value. I realized in that exact moment that Delaney was no longer just my spoiled, heavily protected sibling. She was the weakest, most unstable structural beam in Grant's entire crumbling foundation. She was the silent, cowardly accomplice who could, with the exact right amount of applied pressure, easily become the primary star witness for my prosecution. I told her to go straight home, to say absolutely nothing to her husband about our late-night conversation, and to wait silently for my specific instructions. The following morning, I decided it was time to move the trap forward. I picked up my smartphone and opened the central family group message thread that included my parents, Delaney and Grant. I carefully, deliberately typed out a single message, agonizing over every single syllable to ensure it carried the exact right tone of total defeat and profound emotional exhaustion. "Good morning, everyone. I have spent the last 3 days doing some incredibly difficult soul-searching. The terrifying medical incident at the glass house truly shook me to my core. My physical and mental health must be my primary focus right now. I am seriously considering stepping back and letting someone else help manage the family trust for a while. I want to discuss a formal, legal transition of power. Let us all meet at the glass house on Friday morning." I took a deep breath and hit send. I did not have to wait very long for the trap to spring. Within 10 minutes, the digital read receipts popped up one by one across the screen. I smiled, a cold, incredibly sharp expression blooming in the empty room. That single, carefully crafted message of absolute surrender was the fresh, bleeding bait in the dark water. I knew with absolute certainty that they would not be able to resist surfacing for the final fatal bite. The digital security team did not sleep. Barely 12 hours after my carefully crafted message of surrender hit the family group chat, the lead technician sent a heavily encrypted data file directly to my secure inbox. They had successfully mirrored the cloud backup of the digital tablet Delaney and Grant shared in their main living room. Grant had been meticulous about clearing his daily browser history, but he fundamentally misunderstood how deep system caching actually worked. The technicians resurrected a horrifying, undeniable timeline of late-night internet inquiries made exactly 9 days before the brunch. I sat at my quiet kitchen island, reading the recovered search strings illuminated brightly on my screen. Temporary sedative dose for confusion. How to make someone look drunk without alcohol. Incapacitated trust operator legal precedent. He had literally typed out his exact criminal intentions, researching the absolute most efficient way to chemically hijack my brain. While I was digesting the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his web searches, Gideon Pike initiated another secure voice protocol. He had aggressively cracked the financial firewall surrounding Grant's discretionary spending accounts. "I found the precise origin point of the chemical agent," Gideon announced, his voice a flat, mechanical drone that offered absolutely no comfort. Grant did not buy the substance off the street. He utilized a highly questionable, out-of-state private telemedicine clinic that operates in a massive legal gray area. He paid a premium fee of $800 using a secondary credit card. He tried to be clever by registering the entire patient profile under his legal middle name, Arthur, and routing the discreet shipping to a third-party commercial locker. However, he made a catastrophic amateur error. The clinic strictly required email verification for the final billing receipt, and he utilized a dummy email account that is still permanently linked to his primary mobile phone data plan. I have the digital invoice, the complete shipping manifest, and the exact digital timestamp of his delivery pickup. The avalanche of evidence was gaining a terrifying, unstoppable momentum before I could even close the medical receipts. My phone vibrated with an incoming call from Rosalind Vale. My seasoned attorney sounded unusually tense. Her normal professional distance completely shattered. "I pulled a massive professional favor with a colleague who serves on the country club board with your father," Rosalind explained rapidly, the sound of her pacing echoing over the line. "That unfiled emergency injunction Gideon found hiding on the county legal portal, Victor did not just have it drafted as a vague, protective contingency plan. He actively shopped it around. 4 days ago, your father emailed a slightly redacted version of that exact document to a senior wealth management advisor in the city. In the body of the email, Victor explicitly asked for confidential advice on the absolute fastest administrative procedure to forcefully execute a trustee removal if, and I quote his exact words, Pamela begins to show severe, undeniable signs of mental instability. He was aggressively planting the seeds of your supposed breakdown in the local financial community before you even took your first sip of that coffee. The walls were rapidly closing in on them, but from their highly arrogant perspective, I was the one suffocating. Grant's overwhelming confidence finally outweighed his calculated patience. He called me directly at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, per Rosalind's strict, uncompromising legal instructions. I immediately activated a secondary digital recording device before answering the line. "Pamela, sweetheart," Grant began, his voice dripping with a sickening, beautifully manufactured syrup of brotherly concern. "We all saw your message this morning. I just wanted to reach out privately and say how incredibly proud I am of you for finally recognizing your own physical limitations. I am just so incredibly tired." "Grant," I whispered, injecting a pathetic, breathy vulnerability into my tone, playing the wounded bird perfectly. "Of course you are," he soothed smoothly, "which is exactly why we need to handle this legal transition swiftly and quietly. You know how vicious the corporate world can be. If you drag your feet, or if you insist on a long, drawn-out legal handover, people are going to start asking highly uncomfortable questions. If you do not want the senior partners at Meridian Vale Risk Group to hear nasty gossip about your little medical episode, it is absolutely best for everyone if you just step aside without causing a massive, unnecessary public scene." I stared blankly at the pulsing red light of the recording device resting on my counter. He had just handed me a textbook, felony-level case of extortion. He explicitly, undeniably linked the systematic destruction of my professional corporate reputation to my immediate compliance in handing over the family estate. "I understand completely," I replied softly, before ending the call and saving the audio file to 3 separate secure servers. As the sun began to set, my secure email inbox chimed with a forwarded message from Delaney. True to her terrified, desperate word, she was quietly funneling me the internal communications I desperately needed. It was a lengthy, highly detailed email chain between Grant and a prominent commercial land broker. The broker was expressing serious hesitation about the Prescott Landing deal, clearly citing my well-known, rigid reputation for environmental conservation. Grant's response, sent just 3 days prior to my poisoning, was typed out in bold, arrogant letters. "Do not worry about the new trustee. I am personally guaranteeing that we will completely clear the internal obstacle by the end of the month. Have the purchase contracts fully ready to sign in exactly 14 days. But as I scrolled past the broker emails, I noticed a secondary attachment Delaney had blindly forwarded from their shared home server. It was a digital approval letter from a high-yield, Predatory Credit Institution. I opened the document and felt a sudden, sharp sting of genuine, breathless shock. Grant had just secured a massive revolving line of credit for $150,000. But his name was nowhere to be found on the primary borrower line. He had used Delaney's social security number, her forged electronic signature, and her anticipated future trust inheritance as the sole financial collateral. He was not just trying to steal my power to save his own skin. He was actively, secretly anchoring a massive financial anvil to his own wife's neck. If his grand, toxic scheme somehow failed, he was perfectly positioned to legally let Delaney take the entire catastrophic financial fall while he walked away entirely clean. I stood up from the kitchen island, the cold hardwood floor grounding my bare feet. The danger had completely mutated. This was no longer a tragic, sad story about a family blinded by historical favoritism, or a father too weak to admit his own massive financial failures. It was a calculated, predatory financial conspiracy executed flawlessly by a man who viewed human beings entirely as disposable assets. Grant Holloway was a parasite who had deeply infected my family, and my parents were far too terrified of the resulting fever to seek a proper cure. I walked over to the large bay window, watching the dark, heavy storm clouds rolling in over the distant river. I was completely done playing defense. I was entirely done merely surviving their insidious attacks. I did not just want to legally stop the sale of the land or protect my corporate job. I wanted to systematically dismantle every single delusion Grant possessed. I wanted him to walk right into that final meeting believing he had achieved total, absolute victory, just so I could watch the exact moment his entire world collapsed into dust. I picked up my phone and sent a final confirmation text to Roslyn. The trap was fully set, and the execution was officially scheduled. Elaine arrived at my home early Thursday morning. She wore a perfectly tailored beige cashmere sweater and carried a basket of expensive, artisanal muffins, playing the role of the nurturing mother to absolute perfection. She thought she was arriving to collect my formal, unconditional surrender. I led her into the foyer, my face a carefully constructed mask of passive exhaustion. I led her into the formal sitting room. I did not offer her tea. I simply sat across from her and placed a printed copy of the toxicology report and a high-resolution still image from the security footage directly onto the glass coffee table. The image clearly showed Grant holding the amber vial over my porcelain cup. "Mother," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously steady. Grant did not just wait for me to collapse. He actively, intentionally poisoned me. He put a highly restricted, dangerous chemical sedative into my coffee. I watched her face closely, expecting the natural, instinctual horror any mother should feel upon learning her child had been chemically assaulted. I expected a sharp gasp, a covering of the mouth, a fierce, protective outrage. Instead, Elaine just stared at the glossy paper. Her perfectly manicured fingers twitched, lightly brushing against the edge of her expensive leather handbag. When she finally looked up, her eyes were completely dry. "Are you absolutely certain, Pamela?" she asked. Her voice was thin and shaky, sharpened now by fear. "Is there any possible way this is just a terrible misunderstanding? Because if you take this to the authorities, the scandal will completely destroy this family. It will be in every single local paper. Can we not just handle this quietly? You are stepping down anyway, so the problem is essentially solved." The air in the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a profound, terrifying chasm opening up between us. "Handle it quietly," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He drugged me, Mother. He could have easily stopped my heart. And your first instinct is to ask me to sweep an attempted murder under the rug to protect your country club reputation." Elaine shifted uncomfortably on the expensive sofa, her eyes darting away from my intense gaze. "You are being overly dramatic. Grant is a desperate man. Yes, but he is not a murderer. Your father and I knew he was under immense financial pressure. Victor told me about the terrible real estate loans." "You knew," I demanded, leaning forward. "You knew about the debt. Of course I knew, Elaine snapped, a sudden, defensive edge creeping into her tone. Victor finally confessed everything to me a week before the brunch. We were facing total financial ruin. Pamela, Delaney was going to lose her beautiful home. Grant was going to be completely destroyed in civil court. Victor proposed a very simple, temporary solution. We just needed to sideline you for a short period, just long enough to quickly liquidate the riverfront land and quietly settle the debts. You agreed to declare me mentally incompetent, I stated, the horrifying reality settling heavily into my bones. Elaine let out a harsh, frustrated sigh. I agreed in principle to a temporary administrative restructuring. It was strictly business. I explicitly told Victor I did not want to know the messy details of how he and Grant planned to execute it. I just wanted my youngest daughter to be safe from losing her house. I never, ever told Grant to use a physical drug. I simply assumed they would use your natural exhaustion against you. That was the absolute, most agonizing knife twist of the entire ordeal. She did not physically hand me the poison, but she happily unlocked the door and turned her back while the assassin walked into my house. She knew a violent wave was rapidly approaching to drown me, and she simply took 2 large steps backward so the hem of her cashmere skirt would not get wet. She traded my sanity, my career, and my personal safety for Delaney's financial comfort, deliberately choosing willful ignorance to keep her own conscience clean. You sacrificed me, I whispered, the absolute finality of the statement hanging heavily in the quiet room. You threw me directly to the wolves, because it was more convenient than holding your favorite child accountable. A sudden, sharp gasp echoed from the hallway. I turned my head. Delaney was standing perfectly still in the arched doorway. She had driven our mother over and had quietly let herself in through the unlocked front door while we were arguing. Her face was incredibly pale, completely drained of all color. Elaine scrambled to her feet, her composure finally shattering. Delaney, darling, you were not supposed to hear that. You knew they were planning to destroy Pamela, Delaney asked, her voice trembling violently. She walked slowly into the sitting room, staring at our mother as if she were looking at a complete stranger. You stood in the glass house, smiling and adjusting my collar, knowing Grant and Dad were about to publicly ruin my sister. I was protecting you, Elaine cried out, reaching a hand toward her youngest daughter. I was saving your marriage and your home. Delaney violently recoiled from the touch. The pathetic, fragile shell she had hidden inside for her entire adult life suddenly cracked wide open. She looked at the printed image of Grant pouring the drug, then looked directly into my eyes. For the very first time in our lives, she finally comprehended the massive, staggering cost of her own constant protection. It was no longer just about me quietly packing my belongings to give her the larger bedroom, or covering up her minor social embarrassments. The price of Delaney's comfort was now an actual, undeniable felony. I am so incredibly sorry, Delaney sobbed, turning fully toward me. I was a coward. I let him push you. But I am absolutely done. I am done letting him use me. And I am done letting them sacrifice you. Delaney reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She walked past our weeping mother and placed it firmly onto the glass table, right next to the toxicology report. That is the master password to Grant's encrypted home office server, Delaney stated, her voice suddenly finding a hard, unfamiliar strength. He keeps a secondary set of hidden financial ledgers there. I also formally agree to sit down with your attorney. I will go on the legal record. I will testify under oath that Grant relentlessly pressured this entire family to create a false narrative about your mental health. I will tell the authorities exactly what he planned to do. Elaine gasped in sheer horror. Delaney, you cannot. You will send your own husband to a federal prison. You will completely ruin the family name. The family name is already ruined. Mother, Delaney replied coldly, not even bothering to look back. Grant ruined it, and you helped him. Delaney turned and walked straight out the front door, leaving Elaine standing completely alone in the center of the room. I did not say another word to my mother. I simply pointed toward the exit. She gathered her expensive leather bag and practically fled my home. Her suffocating illusions of a perfect, quiet resolution entirely shattered. When the house was finally silent again, I walked slowly into my private study. I unlocked the heavy, steel-bottomed drawer of my filing cabinet. I reached inside and carefully pulled out a clear, sealed evidence bag. Inside the thick plastic rested the pristine white porcelain cup and the matching saucer from the brunch. I carried the sealed bag over to my large mahogany desk and placed it gently under the bright glow of my reading lamp. I sat in my heavy leather chair and stared at the physical object that had fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of my life. Under the harsh light, I noticed something I had completely missed before. Right at the base of the delicate curved handle, there was a tiny jagged imperfection in the porcelain. It was a microscopic, deep hairline crack. It was incredibly subtle, practically invisible unless you subjected it to intense, unyielding scrutiny. I traced the line of the crack through the thick plastic bag. The terrifying realization settled deep into my soul. The real, irrefutable evidence in this entire nightmare was not just the foreign chemical residue clinging to the bottom of the cup. The truest piece of evidence was the crack itself. My family did not suddenly break apart on the morning of the brunch. They had been deeply, fundamentally broken for decades. The favoritism, the cowardly compromises, the unspoken resentment, and the casual willingness to sacrifice my well-being for the sake of appearances had always been there, quietly fracturing our foundation. Grant did not create the rot inside the Prescott family. He merely recognized the existing decay and brilliantly weaponized it for his own financial gain. I turned off the reading lamp, leaving the cracked porcelain sitting in the darkness. I was fully prepared for the final confrontation. I was no longer fighting to save a family that had never truly existed. I was fighting to absolutely, mercilessly destroy the parasites who had tried to bury me in the ruins. The glass house felt entirely different on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Just a few days prior, it had been a vibrant space filled with the warm scent of artisan pastries and the bright, superficial chatter of a family celebrating a milestone. Now, the long rustic oak table had been stripped of its decorative linen and floral centerpieces, transformed into a cold, rigid corporate battlefield. The morning sky outside the massive glass walls was overcast, casting a flat, gray light over the river and plunging the interior of the room into a heavy, oppressive gloom. I arrived 30 minutes early to arrange the seating, methodically placing heavy leather chairs at precise intervals. I was preparing the stage for the absolute collapse of everything Grant Holloway thought he knew. I carefully curated my appearance to perfectly match the pathetic, broken narrative my family had eagerly swallowed. I chose a shapeless, slate-gray wool dress that hung loosely on my frame, entirely devoid of color or authority. I wore no jewelry, not a single ring or necklace, and tied my hair back into a severe, harsh knot at the nape of my neck. I skipped makeup entirely, allowing the dark, natural circles under my eyes to show prominently. I wore plain flat shoes instead of my usual commanding heels. When I greeted the early arrivals, I kept my voice incredibly soft, almost a whisper, forcing them to lean forward uncomfortably just to hear my hollow pleasantries. I looked exactly like a woman who had been utterly devastated by a sudden medical crisis and terrified by the looming threat of professional ruin. I looked like a woman who had simply shown up to surrender. The attendees filed into the glass house one by one, bringing the thick, suffocating tension with them. My father, Victor, walked in wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his chest puffed out with the aggressive, nervous energy of a man who firmly believed his financial salvation was only a few signatures away. He brought along his personal wealth management advisor, a stern, silent man named Arthur Gable, whom Victor had previously consulted regarding my swift legal removal, the lead buyer from the commercial land development syndicate. An impatient executive named Harrison Vance arrived carrying a thick leather portfolio stuffed with the final purchase agreements. My mother, Elaine, slipped into the room quietly, refusing to make any eye contact with me. She chose a chair at the absolute furthest end of the long table, gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Then Grant walked through the glass doors. His entrance was a masterclass in unearned arrogance. He wore a pristine navy suit with a pale blue silk tie, exuding the flawless, magnetic confidence of a man holding a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. He believed the anonymous, defamatory email he had sent to the Human Resources Department at Meridian Vale Risk Group was currently hanging over my head like a razor-sharp guillotine. He firmly believed the terrifying prospect of a highly public, career-ending corporate scandal involving substance abuse had entirely shattered my will to fight. He offered a warm, incredibly fake smile to the land developer, firmly shook the financial advisor's hand, and took a seat directly across from my designated chair at the head of the table. Delaney walked in a few moments later, keeping a massive physical distance between herself and her husband. She sat 2 seats away from Grant, pulling her chair closer to the glass wall. She did not say a single word. She did not look at him, nor did she look at our parents. She simply stared rigidly down at the intricate wood grain of the oak table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Grant noticed her frigid demeanor, shooting her a brief, mildly annoyed glare. However, his ego was far too massive, his focus far too consumed by the impending millions, to perceive the actual, lethal threat her silence represented. He undoubtedly dismissed her behavior as mere feminine squeamishness regarding the harsh, necessary realities of family business. The heavy antique grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9:15. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting weakly on the table. We were officially waiting for my legal counsel. "It seems your attorney is having some trouble keeping a professional schedule this morning, Pamela," Grant noted smoothly, leaning back in his chair and casually checking his expensive gold watch. He directed his voice toward the land developer and the financial advisor, intentionally performing for the audience. "Hopefully, we will not be delayed much longer. I know we are all incredibly eager to finalize this transition and get Pamela the quiet, intensive rest she so clearly needs." His insult hung in the air, meant to humiliate me and make my side look unprepared. I merely offered a weak, apologetic nod, playing my part flawlessly. At exactly 9:20, the heavy glass doors finally opened. Rosalind Vale walked in, deliberately out of breath, her usually immaculate hair slightly windblown. She dropped her heavy leather briefcase onto the floor with a loud, chaotic thud, hastily apologizing for the terrible morning traffic. Her intentional tardiness was the final, brilliant layer of our manufactured incompetence. Grant visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping, a deeply satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was absolutely certain he had already won. Rosalind unzipped her briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of transfer documents Victor had aggressively demanded. She placed them squarely in the center of the table. Officially. This meeting had only one purpose. I was supposed to formally announce whether I would retain my position as the sole operating trustee or officially sign the documents accepting a temporary co-management board, effectively surrendering all control to my father. The room fell into a deep, expectant silence. The land developer pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket, ready to sign the lucrative purchase agreements the exact second my authority was transferred. Victor leaned forward, his eyes practically burning a hole through the paper. I did not reach for the documents. Instead, I slowly reached down into the large leather tote bag resting near my feet. I pulled out a rigid, completely transparent acrylic display box, measuring roughly 8 inches on all sides. Inside the heavily sealed, clear enclosure, resting on a stark black velvet cushion, was the chipped white porcelain cup and its matching saucer from the brunch. I lifted the clear box and placed it gently, deliberately onto the exact center of the oak table, right next to the towering stack of legal transfer documents. The solid base of the acrylic case made a soft, incredibly final thud against the wood. The atmosphere in the glass house instantly violently fractured. The sudden, inexplicable appearance of the object created a bizarre, profoundly unsettling visual that completely disrupted their carefully scripted reality. The commercial investor frowned deeply, leaning back in his chair in total confusion. Victor blinked rapidly, his confident posture slipping for a fraction of a second as he stared at the dirty coffee cup. Elaine let out a tiny, involuntary gasp, pressing her hand hard against her mouth. Grant stared directly at the clear box. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch pulled violently at the corner of his left eye. The smooth, arrogant mask he had worn all morning flickered, briefly revealing the terrified, calculating predator hiding underneath. No one in the room could rationally explain why a sealed piece of dirty dishware was sitting in the middle of a multi-million-dollar real estate negotiation. It was a silent, unmoving anomaly, and its sheer presence sucked the remaining air right out of the room. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, my face a perfect, unreadable canvas. I did not offer a single word of explanation. I let the oppressive, agonizing silence stretch out, forcing the unbearable weight of the unknown onto their shoulders. Grant desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. He forced his charming smile back onto his face, though it no longer reached his eyes. He leaned forward, attempting to project an aura of patient, patronizing authority, completely unaware that he was stepping directly onto a landmine. "Well, Pamela," Grant said, his voice straining slightly to maintain its smooth cadence. He gestured casually toward the stack of legal papers, blatantly ignoring the transparent box resting inches away from his hand. "Are you finally ready to do the right thing for the family?" I slowly raised my head. I dropped the fragile, exhausted posture entirely. I straightened my spine, locking my eyes directly onto his. The cold, absolute certainty in my gaze made his fake smile falter. "Yes," I replied, my voice no longer a whisper, but clear and steady in the silence. "Today I am going to do exactly what needs to be done." I did not begin the meeting with a frantic defense. I did not offer a tearful accusation or a lengthy, emotional speech about how deeply my family had hurt me. I simply reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out a small black remote control, and aimed it directly at the large digital presentation monitor mounted on the far wall of the glass house. The screen instantly flickered to life, bathing the tense, silent room in the harsh, high-definition glow of the kitchen security camera footage. Everyone around the long oak table froze, their eyes locked onto the screen. We all watched in absolute silence as the digital version of Grant Holloway stood alone by the espresso machine. We watched him nervously check over his shoulder. We watched him pull the dark amber vial from his tailored jacket, pour the unidentifiable chemical substance into my white porcelain cup, and meticulously wipe away the residue with a paper towel. "What kind of manufactured garbage is this?" Grant sputtered, his smooth, arrogant facade finally cracking. He shot up from his heavy leather chair, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Pamela, you cannot possibly expect anyone to believe a spliced, manipulated video you paid someone to create just to dodge your legal responsibilities." Rosalind Vale did not allow him to finish his pathetic sentence. My attorney stood up with the commanding, lethal presence of an executioner. She reached into her briefcase and aggressively slammed a thick, heavily tabbed legal binder directly onto the center of the table, right next to the sealed acrylic box containing the poisoned cup. "That is the certified hospital toxicology report from the emergency room," Rosalind stated, her voice ringing out like a sharp bell in the quiet glass house. "It conclusively confirms the presence of a heavy, unprescribed chemical sedative in Pamela's bloodstream. Right beneath that report is the digital clinic receipt proving you purchased that exact narcotic under a false middle name. Next to that is a fully recovered log of your deleted internet search history, explicitly detailing your research on how to medically incapacitate a trust operator. And finally, we have the certified audio transcript of the phone call you made to Pamela yesterday, where you explicitly threatened to destroy her career at Meridian Vale Risk Group if she did not silently surrender her legal authority." Grant opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked completely paralyzed, like a predator suddenly realizing he had walked directly into a steel trap. But the criminal conspiracy does not end there. Rosalind continued mercilessly, pulling out a second, equally thick dossier provided by Gideon Pike. She tossed copies in front of my father and the stunned commercial land developer. This is a complete forensic mapping of the Holloway financial debt chain. We have the 3 massive defaulted balloon mortgages. We have the secret, highly confidential letter of guarantee legally bearing Victor Prescott's personal signature. We possess the internal email threads between Grant and the commercial buyers, promising to clear the internal family obstacle within 14 days. And most damning of all, we have the draft petition to legally suspend Pamela, which was meticulously prepared and quietly circulated a full 7 days before she ever took a sip of that poisoned coffee. The final, absolute death blow did not come from me, nor did it come from my lawyer. It came from the woman sitting quietly near the glass wall. Delaney slowly stood up from her chair. She looked directly at the commercial investors, completely ignoring her husband's terrified, warning glare. "He told me his plan," Delaney said, her voice shaking but carrying a new, undeniable strength. "Grant told me repeatedly over the last 2 weeks that if Pamela was just disoriented for a few hours and signed the paperwork wrong just one time, the entire trust would automatically fall to my father's control, and it would look entirely legal to the outside world. He manipulated this entire family to steal her inheritance." Harrison Vance, the lead commercial investor, did not hesitate for a single second. Corporate predators recognize a bloodbath when they see one. He instantly stood up, shoved the unsigned purchase agreements violently back into his leather portfolio, and snapped it shut. He was not retreating out of some sudden moral awakening. He was running because he fully understood that this lucrative real estate deal had just detonated into a catastrophic legal minefield. "This meeting is absolutely over," the investor barked, not looking at my father. "Meridian Vale Risk Group will hear about this. We will not touch this contaminated property or this family with a 10-foot pole. Yes. Do not ever contact my office again." He stormed out through the glass doors, taking the family's only financial lifeline with him. Rosalind turned her attention back to the remaining, shell-shocked people at the table. "I have already filed an emergency legal injunction with the state court this morning. It permanently blocks any and all administrative changes to the Prescott Landing Trust management structure. Furthermore, my office has formally transferred this entire dossier to the regional authorities. There is an active, open criminal investigation regarding the severe physical poisoning, the systemic financial fraud, and the coordinated conspiracy to aggressively hijack a multi-million-dollar estate." My father collapsed back into his chair, as if the strength had gone out of him. Victor Prescott stared blankly at his trembling hands, the horrifying reality crashing down upon him. He had spent his entire life trying to be the heroic patriarch who secretly saved his youngest daughter from every consequence. Now, he was the man who had personally signed the financial death warrant that would drag his entire family into a highly publicized, devastating criminal scandal. My mother, Elaine, buried her face in her hands and began to weep loudly, her shoulders shaking with genuine, unfiltered terror. I looked at my parents, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not reach out to comfort them. I did not offer them a secret way out. For the very first time in my 37 years of life, I let the massive, crushing weight of the consequences fall exactly where they belonged. I was no longer their crisis manager. I was no longer their shield. Grant completely lost his mind. The smooth, charming mask melted away, revealing the rabid, vicious animal underneath. He slammed his fists against the oak table, screaming vile, aggressive obscenities. He violently turned on Delaney, his face twisted in pure hatred, entirely blaming her for lacking the stomach to see the plan through. He shouted about his entitlement, about how the family owed him, and how he deserved the money far more than I did. He exposed his pure, unadulterated greed right there in the open light of the glass house. It was a deeply ugly, chaotic tantrum, And it was the exact moment that definitively shattered any lingering, pathetic illusions my parents still desperately held about the man they had welcomed into our home. In the chaotic months that followed that explosive morning, the entire landscape of my life shifted permanently. Delaney officially filed for a divorce, moving out of her massive, heavily leveraged home before the bank could forcibly evict her. The Prescott Landing Trust was completely legally restructured exactly according to my grandmother Evelyn's dying wishes. The land would never be sold to commercial developers. It was locked down, and I remained the sole untouchable operator armed with a dozen new legal fail-safes, ensuring absolutely no one in my bloodline could ever attempt to usurp my authority again. Grant faced multiple felony indictments, his entire world crumbling under the sheer weight of the digital evidence we had gathered. The story does not end with a tearful family reunion. There was no warm embrace of forgiveness, no holiday dinners where we pretended the past was forgotten. I stood completely alone on the grassy bank of the river, just outside the glass house, holding the empty, chipped porcelain cup in my hands. The cool afternoon breeze rustled through the ancient oak trees. I looked at the tiny, jagged crack running down the handle. I finally understood that toxic families do not magically break apart in one single day. They are merely exposed in one single day. The deepest, most absolute revenge was not screaming into the void about how badly I had been betrayed. The ultimate revenge was taking back every piece of power they tried to steal and leaving them to face what they had done. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below so we can connect and share our thoughts on Pamela's journey. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support the channel even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people out there.